Welcome to Larp Academia. Today, we're going to talk about V9, or version 9 for those who are not quite in the know. But version 9 is coming. It's something that is necessary for Amtgard, and we'll talk about why. But before we get into that, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you can stay up to date, so that when V9 actually does come out, we will talk about it when things are finalized, and we'll talk about mechanics and everything else about what's coming up with new classes, so that you'll be able to stay informed on abilities like you have been up until now. Now for V9, before we get into it, we have to think of what was actually good for version 8. Some of us were not around for the transition. I luckily was, and I can tell you that there were quite a few good things that were intended with V8. One is that the speed of battle games were upped. It wasn't, hey, you're frozen for 300 seconds, or hey, you're dead, you have a 300-second count, which no one really did. There was half counts, there was sometimes when we actually did that, but it made people not want to play the game, and they just wanted to go ditching and fight, because who actually wants to play that battle game? Especially when there are lives, which means that Resurrect wasn't always infinite. Resurrect was, you had basically 4 per refresh, or some ridiculous amount that's all you really could get. And that means that they had to choose who the healers were going to resurrect. When they did this, and people had a certain amount of lives, it made it so that the people who were experienced were able to play 2 to 3 times the game length as the new players, and that game just straggled on. So new players either A, had to find a good group that they wanted to craft with, B, wanted to fight a lot and wanted to do a lot of ditching, or C, if they wanted to play classes and play the game, quit, because there wasn't really much that they could do. So, or just get good really quick, even though they require them to get more levels, and or to get skilled in fighting, and it's not really viable for new players. It wasn't very new player friendly. So version 8 made it new player friendly. They enhanced the game in a lot of ways, and they also made it so that aside from it being quicker, they made it cleaner as well. They made it so that V8, if there was one class that had an ability, it's the same as another class that had the ability, and it made sense in the rulebook. You could look into the rulebook and you could say, hey, all right, let's look at the rulebook. We can actually make a ruling based on this and this, and this is actually what it would logically be. And it made sense. So there was quite a few good things with V8. Now, why we're making V9 is because there are some failings with V8. Aside from the idea of, I want to make some new abilities and get some new class stuff, we do need to look at the failings of V8. Now, the failings of V8 are primarily based on this idea of creating V8 in a lone, small 5x5 foot room where you have nowhere to go for about 3 months, and you're trying to scroll and think of things that are happening. And this is honestly how I envision V8 being written, because of the flaws that are in it. They thought of these good things to change, but in doing so, they decided that they were going to make V8 in a setting for a big battle game. V8 works pretty much perfectly well if you have a 30 or even like 50 person plus battle game. Everyone actually does what the rules say. They optimize their equipment, and it all works according to plan, but it doesn't always work according to plan. They didn't really account for reality in a lot of ways. One problem is that many Amtgard parks, I would even venture to say most, are small. They're not these 20, 30 plus battle game people going in it, or 20, 30 plus per side, which is really kind of what it was meant to be. And it's more, it could be even 5 people doing a battle game, where it's 2 and 2 and then a 1. So there's 3 teams of 2, 2 and 1. It's not even close to that idea of this giant battle game. Or it could even be that there's 5 people on each side, and there's a problem. You see, some classes, let's say Healer, Necromancer, they need to be countered, or they'll steamroll the game. In doing so, what if you don't have that class? What if you don't have that class on the battlefield? What if you don't have a scout or a wizard or a druid who has naturalized magic? What are you going to do then? You're going to try to backstab the healer who has constantly people just being thrown at you? I mean, what are you going to do? Really. And there's this problem also where some classes were designed to work in these big battle games, but because they're on this small field, they become literal gods, which is just it's not fun. And they can do it through ways that are kind of cheesy and just not fair. And we'll talk about that when we get to some specific classes. But the other problem with V8, aside from it being built for big battle games, is that there's an optimized way to play each class. If you are going out there as a warrior in 6 points, you're fully optimizing your class. If you are going out there as a scout in 3 points, you are fully optimizing your class. If you are not doing this, you're probably not going to be as powerful as a 6th level caster. You're probably not going to have the options that you really want. And if you don't have armor, you shouldn't play warrior. If people don't actually optimize their class, things break down. We just said how warrior, you don't really want to play it if you don't have armor. Well, what about barbarians? Some classes have their abilities based on the assumption that other people are going to optimize their classes. Well, if no one's wearing armor, what's the point of armor breaking for a barbarian? You're starting to see some flaws and some cracks already, where classes that are dependent upon other people having things and those classes not having them means that you're not going to have them be as strong as you would originally intend. And since people are not fully optimizing their class, V8 breaks down even further. Now, this goes beyond just some classes being overpowered or unplayable at small levels and people not optimizing their kits entirely in order to play. V8 also didn't fully consider what people will do. Now, I talked about how, in V7, players decided to not really play by the 300 count rule. They actually had a thing called Halfcount, where all abilities were cut in half, and that's 2.5 times the amount of length we have for all of our stuff still. So you can see it's ridiculous. They didn't account into reality of what people would actually do in version 7, and they still didn't account for what people would do in version 8. For example, shove while a person's late. There's a huge discussion on this at Facebook that I kind of created, and it technically, according to the rulebook, when shoving a person who is legged, make them have to crawl 20 feet. It's not unsafe 90% of the time, and they just crawl slower, if they crawl slower, which, makes sense. However, no one's going to do that. No one actually has done that. People have been getting up and walking since when I started playing about a decade ago or something, a long time. Wow, I'm old. But people have not followed the rules of the game for whatever reason. So you need to think about, okay, how is this going to be applied? There are also some other curious examples. Like, let's say that I have stone skin and I have gift of air. If I'm hit with an arrow, what happens? I'll give you a moment to answer that. All right, now that you've had a moment, it is sort of confusing. You would think, well, gift of air triggers. And yes, it does. Gift of air triggers because when struck, it triggers. But when struck, your armor also takes a point. So if you're hit with a projectile, not only do you go in substantially and use gift of air, but you lose a point of stone skin. It's not very intuitive. It's kind of there that you could figure out. But again, are people actually going to follow this? It's a little bit of an issue. That's why V8 didn't really consider the full reality of what people would actually do in these situations. Now, some things that we should actually change is that we should make it so that classes have more options, but keep them balanced. I know this is a difficult task. However, we have the tool to do this. It's called Archetypes. Why don't we just apply Archetypes to martial classes? It would give options, it would open up a bunch of other things, and one thing we want to do in V9 is we want to make sure that it's not a complete game change. From V7 to V8, the game completely changed. It was pretty much unrecognizable. We don't want to do that. We don't want to add so many abilities that, it's just ridiculous. I mean, yeah, a few new abilities, sure, that's fine, but we don't want to completely overhaul the game. We want to fix the problems that are in V8 and add options. Not change the game, but make it so that players can play how they want and are able to still play within the class guidelines, of course, but feel as if they have more agency in their class creation or before the game, so that when they play their class, they can embody it and make it really their own. Now, when we get into spellcasters, there's a little bit of a difference per spellcaster. It's kind of on basis, and we'll judge that based on what the spellcasters are. But again, these are proposed changes, so take them with a grain of salt. This is probably a more moderate approach to V9. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. So before we get into that, let's just keep an open mind, and I'm not going to overhaul the system with my changes. I'm going to merely add options. Now, with that, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section down below and what we can do to help improve Amtgard. Until next time, keep LARPing and don't subscribe. Until next time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, and keep LARPing.